Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. The psychoanalytic theory of development. Key aspects of Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Freud, 1933, stem from his work with patients who had psychological disorders like anxiety and depression that manifested in physical problems such as partial paralysis or sudden blindness, what Freud called hysterical disorders. Freud thought that, as these disorders did not seem to have physical origins, they must have origins in our psyche or our mind. The mind therefore had to be investigated if he was to understand why these patients were experiencing such devastating physical problems. Take, for example, your decision to study psychology. Why have you chosen to do this? Is it to study in more detail something? Human behavior, perhaps, that fascinates you? Are you studying psychology in order to get the foundation education needed to go into a therapeutic profession? Whatever your reason, according to Freud, you will all be doing it for the fundamental motivation of encouraging pleasure, e.g., following your passion for studying human behavior, or avoiding pain, e.g., going into a profession or career you have little interest in. Freud's theory of psychosexual development, Freud, 1949, expanded on the nature of the pleasure/pain motivation in developing each of our personalities. Freud argued that our personality is composed of three parts: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID effectively reflects our basic biological impulses. It controls our sexual needs, our food and drink needs, our warmth and comfort needs. The ego describes the conscious decision-making part of us. It develops in the first few years of life to manage and deliver the needs of the ID. The third part of the personality, the superego, reflects the social norms of the community the child is growing up in. This part of the personality naturally becomes more sophisticated as the child ages and is exposed to more rules and regulations. Freud described the number of ways in which people try to cope with anxiety as defense mechanisms. If you were unable to cope with the anxiety of unresolved libido, then you would experience psychological tensions, anxiety, depression, and other mental illness, whether that anxiety stemmed from events recently or events a long time in your past. What type of mental illness you experienced could be linked to the age at which you experienced the anxiety induced by an unsuccessfully acting ego and the defense mechanisms or manner in which you tried, also unsuccessfully, to cope. Freud described a number of key stages in a person's life that corresponded with different demands of the pleasure/pain motivation. The libido. Freud believed from talking to his patients that the main driving force behind the libido was not satisfying the survival needs of hunger, thirst, and warmth, but sexual satisfaction. Thus, his theory is called the theory of psychosexual development. See Table 2.1 for a brief description of the stages. Freud described a number of key stages in a person's life that corresponded with different demands of the pleasure/pain motivation, the libido. Freud believed from talking to his patients that the main driving force behind the libido was not satisfying the survival needs of hunger, thirst, and warmth, but sexual satisfaction. Thus, his theory is called the theory of psychosexual development. See Table 2.1 for a brief description of the stages. Freud's theory of psychosexual development gave him a framework for understanding the sources of his patient's anxiety. The patient who presented as obese and found herself feeling socially ostracized because of it he described as having unresolved issues at the oral stage of development. Her ID wanted food and experienced pleasure with eating. The superego was constructed of the social norm possibly based in the religious ideal of slim body shape and the rejection of overeating as the sin of gluttony. Her ego could not resolve the conflict between her hunger and pleasure from eating and her religious beliefs of moderation, and thus she experienced a high level of anxiety. The patient who found himself unable to settle into relationships and experience sexual intimacy with his wife had unresolved conflict at the phallic stage. He had not been able to identify well with his father as a child and had not developed a stable sexual identity for himself and others. His ID wanted sexual satisfaction at any cost, and his superego required sexual behavior within the realms of marriage. His ego struggled to moderate his sexual libido, and he therefore experienced anxiety within his relationship and sought satisfaction outside the marriage. Freud's interest in the causes of his patient's anxiety developed into an interest in the coping strategies his patients used to alleviate the anxiety. Rather than resolving the sources of the emotional upset, all his patients used what Freud called defense mechanisms to cover up their feelings. Some patients used denial and behaved as if the problem did not exist. Others used repression and pushed the memory away to the back of their minds or rationalized their behavior to justify their feelings. Other defense mechanisms reported were projecting the beliefs of yourself onto others or displacing emotions onto someone else instead of the person the anger or anxiety was provoked by, and some patients even regressed their behavior to a younger age, such as sucking their thumb as an adult in the face of adversity. Critique: Freud's writing on the theory of the conscious and unconscious mind initiated discussion and research into understanding the motivations for behavior and the causes of emotional upset in people. Other theorists discredited him for his lack of academic rigor in constructing and presenting his theories, and many people believe his theory to be lacking in empirical evidence. In Chapter 3, you will discover the importance of research methodologies in providing academic rigor in the form of an evidence base for our understanding of human behavior. That chapter will show you how we use a range of techniques to acquire knowledge and understanding of the developing child. However, it is important to know Freud's work, as many other more critically acclaimed developmental theories arose from his work, and his notion of age-related stages of development forming a hierarchical model of behavioral achievement is evident in many developmental scientists' work.